So last lecture we talked about how cost functions were a combination of two things: fixed costs, which don't depend upon output, and variable costs that do. So what we want to do this lecture is we want to talk a little bit more about this, about what fixed and variable costs are. So as I said, we can break down costs into fixed costs, which do not depend upon output, and variable costs that depend upon output. Now, it's important to remember when you talk about variable costs that they need to depend upon output. It doesn't just mean that they vary. So they must vary as output changes. A good example of this might be if a firm that had air conditioning, for example. So you can imagine that a firm had air conditioning and in its factory, and you might say, well, this is obviously a variable cost because variable costs vary, and you know your air conditioning, if you live in Texas, for example, your air conditioning might be pretty high, and your variable cost might be pretty high in the summer, but would be pretty low in the winter. So they vary throughout the year. So, but that doesn't make them variable costs. A variable cost means it has to vary depending upon output. So, for example, if you run your factory all year round, just because they're higher in the summer than in the winter doesn't make them a variable cost. They only would vary if they vary according to your output. So that makes air conditioning a fixed cost for your firm. So remember, variable costs have to vary, but they have to depend upon your output level, and fixed costs don't. And we'll talk more about this fixed cost and variable costs when we talk about market structure. So as we said before, mathematically we write total costs, a function of output, equal to fixed costs plus variable costs. And the fixed costs don't depend upon output levels, so they're not a function of Q, as we mentioned last time. So there's no parentheses Q here. And the reason we don't need it is because they don't depend upon Q. They don't depend upon the output level. Variable costs do depend upon the output level, and so we would say variable costs are a function of Q. Okay. So let's give an example. Let's look at an example here. We've got a cost function. It's for manufacturing Kindles, and the cost is $1 million plus $203 times the amount of output plus 0.5 times output squared. And so we want to know what are the fixed costs in this function and what are the variable costs in this function. So the fixed costs are those things that don't depend upon Q. So the $1 million here doesn't depend upon Q. Whether you produce nothing or you produce 1 million units, it's still $1 million. This part obviously does depend upon Q. It's $203 for each Kindle you produce. But finally, we have this second part here, which is 0.5 Q squared. That also depends upon Q, so those aren't fixed costs. So the last two parts, the 203Q plus the 0.05 Q squared, both of those are going to be variable costs in this function. Okay, so let's think about this kind of in practical terms. What would a fixed and variable cost do? So let's imagine we have a shoe factory. So what might the fixed costs be? Well, one thing is you've got this shoe factory and you don't own it, you rent it from somebody, and so you pay rent for this building. And whether you sell 100 pairs of shoes or 1,000 pairs of shoes or 10,000 pairs of shoes, you've still got to pay the rent. Your rent doesn't depend upon how many shoes you sell, so that would be a fixed cost. You've hired a manager and you've got your manager on a long-term contract, so you have to pay the manager whether you make 100 pairs of shoes or 1,000 pairs of shoes. So that makes salary for the manager a fixed cost. So what might be the variable cost? Well, one variable cost might be the wages for your hourly workers. So you hire hourly workers and you pay them by the hour, but you don't guarantee them any number of hours in a week, so you can kind of see yourself like a fast food restaurant. You tell your workers to come in when you need them, and you tell them not to come in when you don't need them, and you may only give them their schedules a few days in advance. So wages for hourly workers, as you make more shoes, you need to hire more workers. So if you've got a big order, say for 10,000 pairs of shoes, you have all your hourly workers working overtime. If you don't have many orders, then you don't bring many of your hourly workers in. So as you make more shoes, you need to hire more workers. So that would be a variable cost. It depends upon how many shoes you're making. Leather for the shoes. The more shoes you make, you need to buy, assuming you make leather shoes. The more shoes you make, you need to buy more leather, so that would make leather a variable cost. If you make 1 million pairs of shoes, you need a lot more leather than if you make one pair of shoes. Now, it's kind of In theory, the distinction between variable costs and fixed costs is kind of clear. In a function, you can tell what the variable costs and what the fixed costs are. In practice, this distinction between fixed and variable costs is somewhat fuzzy, and many costs turn out to be fixed in the short run but variable in the long run. And some costs are fixed over small ranges of output. So if you have a shoe factory, it may not matter much whether you produce 100 pairs or 200 pairs, but it would make a difference if you needed to make, say, 1,000,000 pairs and needed to build 3 new factories to build them. So they may be fixed over small ranges of output. So let's think about a moving company now. Your wages paid to hourly workers. Now, again, you only bring your hourly workers in if you need them. So if you don't have any jobs that day, you don't bring them in, so you don't pay them. So the firm only gives your workers hours if you have moves planned. So the cost depends upon the number of moves that you have, and that's how many workers you bring in. So the salary for hourly workers are a variable cost in the short run. In the long run, there's still a variable cost. You still, if you have lots of orders over a long period of time, you still need to bring the more workers in when you have them. So it's also a variable cost in the long run too. So this is always a variable cost. Now let's think about your lease payments for the moving truck. So you've got a moving truck and you've leased it. You didn't buy it. And the cost of the truck doesn't depend upon the planned moves in a single week. You still have to pay your lease. Even if you don't have any moves for that week, you still have to pay the lease for it. So the cost of the lease is a fixed cost, at least in the short term. In the long term, though, it might become a variable cost. That is, you can lease more trucks if your demand moves high for a long extended period of time. So say that you've got just like next week you have say 10 moves, but every other week you only have 5 moves. You're not going to get a new truck just for next week. You won't lease a new truck for it. So in the short run, your trucks are fixed. But if you move up to 10 moves every week, then you'll lease another truck, and you'll have so it becomes variable in the long run. People often ask, what makes the long run and the short run? So the basic way we define long run and short run is kind of circular, but we'd said in the long run, in the short run, your fixed costs are fixed. In the long run, they're not fixed anymore. So it could vary a lot from business to business. So the short run for, say, if you're an economic consultant, and you work for maybe governments, or you work for companies and you do economic consulting for them, the short run is a very short period of time. You can quickly you can quickly ramp up production, and you can quickly vary it, buy new equipment. So if you, for example, need to buy a new piece of software, you can quickly do it. So you can adjust very quickly. If you have something like a nuclear power plant, then it takes a long time to build a nuclear power plant. So the long run is a long time. So how long the long run is how quickly you can adjust these equipment and a capital that you're buying is the one way to think about it. Okay, now another way that fixed and variable costs is if you think about if you have one truck. Let's imagine your moves are big enough so you can do 1 move per day per truck. Then if you have 1 to 7 moves per week, the cost of the truck doesn't depend upon whether you have 1 or 7. So it's fixed between 1 and 7 moves per week. But if you move up to, say, 8 truck moves a week, then you can't do that with only 1 truck, so you need 2 trucks. So it's kind of fixed when your production isn't varying very much, but it starts to vary once your production varies more because you need to lease more of them. So it's higher for 8 moves and 7 moves, so it becomes variable at this level. And then it's fixed again between 8 and 14 moves per week. So this kind of idea of fixed and variable costs is a little bit artificial because it's a little bit fuzzy. And this is kind of important when I ask you on homework assignments whether things are fixed or variable costs. You need to exactly explain to me what it is you're thinking about, and or when you're thinking about something as a fixed or variable cost in your mind, you need to think about, well, am I thinking about the short term, the long term? Am I thinking over the ranges of likely production that we're going to have? These kind of things. Practically on homework assignments, what this means is that you need to always explain your answer. So if I say, is this a fixed cost or a variable cost, it'll never be good enough just for you to write fixed or variable. You'll need to go, it is a fixed cost because. and then you'll need to explain why it is. And it could be that if you give a very good reason why it's a fixed cost, and somebody else gives me a very good reason why it's a variable cost, maybe you're thinking in the short term and they're thinking in the long term, then you could both get full marks for it. But you'll need to explain yourself well, and this is the key thing. That because it's fuzzy, you need to put a little bit more effort than just saying yes, no. Now, this said, there will be times when you have multiple choice questions, for example, on fixed and variable costs, and then you need to answer which you have to guess what your instructor thinks is the best answer to the question, because he probably won't give you credit if you answer what isn't the best idea for it. So if on a quiz it's multiple choice, then you need to think carefully. But generally, if you're doing an exam, you want to think about, and you're asked an open-ended question, you want to explain your answer. When I give exams, I usually write in big letters, explain. So I say, is the wages for hourly workers a fixed cost or a variable cost? Explain, and then you can go, and then you'll have to explain why it's a fixed or variable cost. Okay, so that's my first talking about what your exams are going to look like and what your quizzes are going to look like. But just remember, you always want to explain things. Whenever we have these slightly fuzzy concepts, when they move from theory, where they're very, very exact, to the real world, where suddenly your theory isn't quite as exact as you thought it was, you need to explain your answers. Okay, so that's it for fixed costs and variable costs. Next, we're going to talk about implicit and explicit costs.